The Haunted Doll. Hello friends, welcome to the horror ghost stories. The story begins. In an old town nestled between the mountains and the forest, there was a small, weathered house at the edge of a winding road. The house had been empty for years, its windows covered with thick layers of dust, and the front yard overgrown with weeds. Yet, some people still whispered about the place, recalling rumors of strange occurrences and an eerie presence that lingered around it. The house had been left behind by a family that had mysteriously vanished many years ago. The only thing that remained was a single, peculiar object, a doll. The doll was a delicate thing, made of porcelain, with hollow eyes that seemed to follow anyone who entered the room. It had an almost lifelike appearance, with golden curls framing its porcelain face and a faded pink dress that looked like it had once been new. The doll sat motionless on a small rocking chair, facing the window as if waiting for someone. Years passed, and no one dared go near the house. People spoke of strange noises coming from inside during the dead of night, faint footsteps, soft murmurs, and the occasional creaking of the rocking chair. But no one saw the doll move, at least not with their own eyes. One autumn evening, a young woman named Clara, new to the town, moved into the neighboring cottage. Clara was a curious soul, and she had heard the stories about the old house from the locals. But instead of feeling afraid, she was drawn to it, fascinated by the mystery that surrounded it. She had always been intrigued by things that others found unnerving, and the stories of the haunted doll only fueled her desire to learn more. One rainy afternoon, Clara decided to visit the house. She bundled up in her coat, took a deep breath, and walked down the overgrown path to the front door. Her heart raced as she reached for the door handle, feeling a strange shiver run down her spine. The door creaked open with ease, revealing the dust-filled interior of the house. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and forgotten memories. Clara stepped inside, the floorboards groaning beneath her weight. The room was silent except for the soft patter of rain against the windows. There, sitting in the corner of the room, was the doll. Its eyes glimmered in the dim light, staring directly at Clara as if it had been waiting for her. She walked cautiously toward it, her footsteps echoing in the stillness of the house. The rocking chair creaked slightly, though Clara hadn't touched it. She stopped just in front of the doll, her gaze locked with its cold, unblinking eyes. Suddenly, a chill filled the air, and Clara felt an inexplicable sense of dread. Her fingers twitched, and against her better judgment, she reached out and touched the doll's hand. The moment her fingers brushed the porcelain, the room seemed to darken, and a voice soft and almost inaudible whispered her name. Clara pulled her hand back, but the voice lingered, growing louder. "Clara, come closer." She froze, heart pounding. The room seemed to grow colder, and the rocking chair creaked again, this time in a rhythmic motion, as though someone or something was sitting in it. "Who's there?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. There was no answer, but the rocking continued. Then, without warning, the doll's head turned toward her. Clara gasped, stumbling back. The doll's expression was no longer serene, instead, it wore an unsettling, twisted smile, its eyes wide and lifeless. Terrified, Clara turned to leave, but the door slammed shut in her face with a deafening crash. She whipped around to find the room darker than before. The only light now came from the dim glow of the fireplace, casting long, eerie shadows against the walls. The doll had somehow moved again. It was now sitting upright in the chair, its head tilted slightly to one side, its grin widening. Clara's breath came in ragged gasps as she backed away. "No, this isn't real," she muttered to herself, but the feeling of unease grew stronger, suffocating her. She darted toward the window, hoping to escape, but it was no use. The windows were sealed tight, as if the house itself refused to let her go. Then, the whispers started again, this time louder and more urgent. "Clara, you're here, come closer." Her legs shook as she turned toward the voice, and to her horror, the doll was standing now, its porcelain feet tapping lightly against the floor. Its head lolled to one side as if it were a puppet being controlled by an invisible hand. In a panic, Clara rushed to the door, trying once more to open it. But it wouldn't budge. She pounded on the wood, screaming for help, but there was no answer. The voice in her head grew louder, and she realized with a sinking feeling that it wasn't just the doll whispering. The entire house seemed to be alive, breathing, pulsing with an ancient, malevolent energy. Then, with a loud crash, the rocking chair toppled over. Clara spun around to see the doll standing directly in front of her. It had moved so quickly, so silently, that she hadn't even seen it shift. "Let me out!" she cried, her voice breaking. The doll tilted its head further, its eyes now empty voids of darkness. Clara reached out to shove it aside, but as her hand made contact, the doll's body suddenly jerked violently. It opened its mouth wide, revealing rows of sharp teeth, its lips curling into a mocking smile. Clara staggered backward, unable to tear her eyes away. "Please, stop," she whispered, barely able to breathe as the doll took another step forward, its movements jerky, unnatural. The whispers surrounded her, as if coming from every corner of the room, from the walls themselves. "You shouldn't have come," the voice hissed. "Now you belong to me." Clara's vision blurred as the room began to spin. She tried to escape, but the doll was everywhere, its cold touch reaching out from all directions, pulling at her limbs, dragging her toward the chair. With one final scream, Clara collapsed, the world going black as the doll's laughter echoed in her ears. The next morning, the house stood silent once more. The rain had stopped, and the sun was shining through the cracks in the broken windows. The door to the house was still sealed shut, and nothing had changed. But the doll remained in its chair, its eyes once again lifeless, waiting for its next victim. No one ever saw Clara again. She was swallowed by the house, and the whispers of the doll faded into the night. But some say that, on quiet evenings, you can still hear her voice, calling out from inside the old house, trapped forever in the grip of the haunted doll. The town slowly moved on, life going back to normal, but Clara's disappearance remained a mystery. The house stood there, a haunted relic of the past, a constant reminder to those who dared venture too close. No one talked much about Clara anymore, but the stories about the doll, about the house continued to spread, whispered in hushed tones around campfires and taverns. As the years passed, a new family came to town. The Martins were a young couple, eager to make a fresh start in the quiet village, away from the noise and chaos of the city. They had heard the rumors about the old house, but they dismissed them as mere superstitions, the kind of stories that people tell to scare children. The Martins were practical folk, and they didn't believe in things like ghosts or curses. It wasn't long before they stumbled upon the abandoned house while walking through the town. The moment they saw it, something drew them to it. Perhaps it was the curiosity that had been planted by the local stories, or maybe it was the house itself, beckoning them closer. The Martins stood in front of the house for a while, debating whether they should enter. The door was slightly ajar, and the sound of wind rustling through the trees made it seem like the house was waiting for them. After a brief exchange, they decided to go inside. The air was thick with dust, the smell of decay heavy in the silence. The house seemed abandoned, just as the locals had said. Nothing seemed to move, nothing at all, except for the faint creaking of the floorboards beneath their feet. They wandered deeper into the house, marveling at the old furnishings, the remnants of a life long gone. As they explored, they stumbled upon the room where Clara had first encountered the doll. The door was cracked open, and inside, the rocking chair sat eerily still in the center of the room. But this time, something was different. The doll was still there, but it was not sitting in the chair. The doll had been placed on the floor, its porcelain body facing the door as if waiting for them. Mr. Martin bent down to pick up the doll, laughing nervously. "Looks like this old thing still wants attention," he said, holding it in his hands. It was cold to the touch, its glassy eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made him pause. For a brief moment, there was silence. Then, the house seemed to shift. The air grew colder, and the faint sound of whispers began to swirl around them. At first, it was indistinct, just a murmur in the background. But as they stood there, it grew louder and clearer. The voice was not just one, but many dozens of voices, all speaking at once, blending together into a cacophony of whispers. The voices sounded angry, desperate, almost pleading. "Put it down," a voice hissed from behind them. "Leave the house," another one urged. But Mr. Martin, who was still holding the doll, didn't listen. He laughed again, brushing it off as a strange coincidence. "It's just the wind," he said, his voice shaky but trying to remain confident. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, and the house seemed to hold its breath. But then, the doll's head turned. Just like before, it jerked in an unnatural motion, its eyes fixing on Mr. Martin's face. The chill in the air grew colder still, so intense it felt like the breath of something ancient and malevolent. The rocking chair creaked behind them, though no one was sitting in it. The doll's mouth opened, and in a voice that was more a growl than anything human, it spoke. "Why are you here?" it demanded. "Why do you disturb me?" The Martins froze. The doll's voice was low, a guttural rasp that seemed to seep into their bones. For a moment, they both stood there, frozen in place, unsure if what they were experiencing was real. The room felt oppressive, heavy with a presence they couldn't understand. Then, without warning, the door slammed shut behind them. The wind outside howled, and the faint light from the setting sun was now completely obscured by thick clouds. The room grew darker by the second. Who are you?" Mrs. Martin whispered, her voice trembling with fear. But before she could get an answer, the doll's head turned completely around, its once peaceful porcelain face now contorted in a grotesque smile. Its eyes glowed faintly, an unnatural light flickering from within, like embers in a fire. "Who am I?" the doll repeated, its voice growing louder, distorted. "I am the one who waits. The one who feeds on your fear. The one who never leaves." The Martins backed away, their hearts racing. The walls seemed to close in around them as the doll's whispers filled the room, growing more frantic, more desperate. The rocking chair began to move again, slowly at first, but soon it was rocking violently, back and forth, as though it were alive, seeking someone to claim. "Leave now!" the voices shouted, becoming a chorus of angry, pleading souls. But the door, the same door that had been open when they arrived, refused to open. No matter how much they pulled at the handle, it wouldn't budge. Panic set in. "MRS!" Martin screamed, her voice echoing through the house, but there was no answer, no help. It was as if the house itself had swallowed them whole. The doll's eyes fixed on Mr. Martin again. This time, it spoke directly into his mind, its voice a terrible, invasive presence. "You will never leave. You will stay, like the others, forever." The last thing Mr. Martin saw was the porcelain doll's twisted face, its mouth stretching into a wide, hungry grin. Then, the world went black. The next morning, the house was once again silent. The Martins had disappeared without a trace. Their cottage stood empty, as if they had never been there at all. The house, with its rocking chair and cursed doll, continued to sit at the edge of the village, waiting for the next wanderers to cross its path. The whispers could still be heard on the wind, carrying the voices of those who had come before, all trapped in the house, feeding the doll's insatiable hunger. And so it remained, a place of terror, a house that never forgot, and a doll that waited. As time passed, the house remained untouched, standing like a sentinel at the edge of the village, its reputation growing darker with each passing year. Despite the chilling tales that surrounded it, there were always those brave or foolish enough to attempt to uncover the secrets hidden within its walls. One such person was Daniel, a historian with an insatiable curiosity for the supernatural. He had heard whispers of the haunted house since he was a child, but it wasn't until he became an adult that he decided to investigate for himself. Determined to uncover the truth, Daniel packed a small bag and set off toward the house one autumn evening, the same time when the air grew cold and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long. The locals warned him against going, but Daniel was undeterred. They spoke of the doll, of the strange disappearances, but he chalked it up to superstition. There was no way he could believe in such fantastical stories. He was a man of reason, driven by logic and a desire to uncover the truth behind the mysterious disappearances that had plagued the house for generations. As he arrived at the old house, the once familiar sight of its decaying exterior now seemed more menacing than ever. The windows, which had once been merely covered with grime, now appeared to stare back at him, like eyes of some forgotten monster. The door was slightly ajar, just as it had been for the Martins, beckoning him inside. With a deep breath, Daniel stepped through the threshold, the creaking of the door echoing through the empty house. He immediately noticed the chilling stillness that seemed to envelop him. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and it carried the faint scent of something long decayed. There was no sign of life, no footprints, no discarded objects, just layers of dust that covered everything. He took a moment to steady himself and then began to explore the house, carefully moving from room to room. His flashlight swept over old furniture, faded wallpaper, and cobwebs in every corner. There was no sign of the doll, but Daniel felt an undeniable sense of being watched. The house seemed alive in its own way, each creak and groan of the floorboards telling a story of its own. It wasn't until he reached the room with the rocking chair that he saw it. The doll was there, just as it had been in the stories, a fragile, porcelain figure sitting in the same corner of the room, its eyes hollow and lifeless, its mouth frozen in a permanent grin. It sat on the same small rocking chair, still as a statue, but Daniel could swear it looked different. The air around it seemed colder, and the once clear eyes appeared darker than before. Daniel stood frozen, staring at the doll. He had expected to feel fear, but instead, he felt only a strange pull, an inexplicable urge to get closer. It was as if the doll was calling to him, drawing him in. Shaking off the sensation, he took a cautious step forward, his flashlight beam focusing on the doll's cracked porcelain face. Then, something strange happened. The room seemed to grow darker, the air thick with an oppressive weight. The once still rocking chair began to creak, moving back and forth as if something unseen was sitting in it. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as he took another step closer to the doll, his hand trembling as he reached out toward it. As his fingers brushed the cold porcelain, the temperature in the room dropped suddenly, a rush of icy air sweeping over him. The doll's eyes snapped open with a sickening crack, glowing with a deep, unnatural light. Its mouth stretched into a horrific, toothless grin, and the voice that filled the room was no longer a whisper, it was a roar, deafening and filled with malice. "You shouldn't have come," the doll's voice echoed, its tone dripping with venom. "You're just like the others. You will never leave." Daniel stumbled back, heart pounding in his chest. He tried to turn and run, but his legs felt heavy, as though the air itself had become thicker, more oppressive. The rocking chair continued to move, now at an unnaturally fast pace, rocking violently back and forth as the doll's eyes followed him, tracking his every movement. He reached for the door, but it wouldn't open. The house was holding him in place, trapping him like so many before. The whispers grew louder, surrounding him from every direction. "Come closer," they beckoned, "it's too late to leave." A sudden chill ran down his spine as he realized something was moving around him in the dark. Shadows, twisted and contorted, slithered along the walls, growing longer, more grotesque. The room began to spin, and the walls seemed to close in, suffocating him. Then, just as he thought he might lose control, something pulled him toward the rocking chair. It was as if invisible hands gripped his body, forcing him to kneel before the doll. He tried to fight it, but the pull was overwhelming, and soon, he found himself face to face with the cursed object. The doll's eyes bored into his soul, and the voices grew louder, merging into a single, unified scream. "You belong to me now," the doll crooned, its voice a twisted mockery of human sound. "You will feed the curse. You will never leave." The room seemed to spin faster, and Daniel's vision blurred as the weight of the house pressed down on him. His body felt heavy, his thoughts scattered and chaotic. In that moment, he understood the true horror of the house. It wasn't just the doll, it was the house itself. The place had become a prison, a feeding ground for the dark presence that had claimed it. And as Daniel fell to his knees, the last thing he saw was the doll's smile stretching impossibly wide, a dark void swallowing him whole. Days passed before anyone noticed Daniel was missing. When they finally ventured to the house, they found it as silent and desolate as ever. The door was closed, but the inside was unchanged. Dust covered every surface, the rocking chair was still, and the doll remained in the corner, its hollow eyes staring into the distance. But as they looked around, they noticed something unsettling. The shadows seemed to cling to the walls, moving ever so slightly as if alive. And in the silence, they could almost hear the faintest sound of something, or someone, rocking back and forth. The doll, once again, had claimed another soul. The house, it seemed, would always wait. Always hunger. Always whispering to those who dared to step too close. And so, the cycle continued. No one ever learned the truth about the curse that haunted the house. But as long as the doll remained, the house would never be free. The curse would continue, passing from one person to the next, forever bound in the grip of the haunted doll. Years passed since Daniel disappeared into the house, and life in the village resumed its slow, mundane rhythm. The house, still perched at the edge of the town, grew more dilapidated with each passing season. Its windows were nearly impossible to see through, covered in thick layers of dust and grime. The door, once slightly ajar, now stood stubbornly shut, as though it had finally grown tired of being opened by the unwelcome visitors who had ventured inside. And yet, the rumors never ceased. Locals would still speak of the doll, of the house, but never too loudly, for fear of invoking its dark presence. The curse, they said, had not been lifted. It had only grown stronger, fed by the souls of those who dared to enter. One bitterly cold winter, another young woman named Lila, an outsider who had recently moved to the village, decided she would be the one to finally solve the mystery of the haunted house. She had heard the stories, of course everyone had, but Lila was different. She was a skeptic. A rational person, unwilling to believe in tales of ghosts or curses. After settling into her new life, she had become fascinated with the history of the village and its many oddities. The house intrigued her the most. Why had no one ever truly investigated it? Why had so many people simply disappeared without a trace? Determined to find out the truth, Lila made her way to the house one cold evening, wrapped in a heavy scarf and bundled in her coat. The sky was overcast, and snow began to fall lightly, settling over the ground and muffling her footsteps as she walked the narrow path toward the house. It was a silent, eerie journey, as though the world itself had stilled in anticipation. She reached the house and stood for a moment, just outside the door. The sight of it now, after hearing so much about it, made her feel uneasy. The air seemed unnaturally still, and even the snowflakes that fell around her seemed to avoid touching the ground near the house, as if they were afraid. But Lila shook off the feeling. She was here to uncover the truth, and nothing would stop her. With one final deep breath, she reached for the door handle and pushed. The door creaked open, its heavy wooden frame resisting at first before it reluctantly gave way. The darkness inside the house enveloped her. The floorboards groaned under her weight as she stepped in, and the faint smell of decay filled the air. It was colder inside than it had been outside, and the silence was deafening. Lila made her way into the house, her flashlight casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. It felt like the house was watching her, like it was waiting. She moved cautiously through the abandoned rooms, each one more forlorn than the last, until she finally reached the room where the doll was said to reside. The room was just as she had imagined, dust-covered, filled with the weight of a forgotten time. But there, in the corner, was the rocking chair. And sitting in it, as though it had never moved, was the doll. Its porcelain body was cracked in places, its once lustrous hair matted and tangled. Its eyes, those cold, lifeless eyes, seemed to pierce through the darkness, locking onto Lila as though it recognized her. Her heart skipped a beat, but she steadied herself. "It's just a doll," she muttered under her breath, trying to quell the anxiety that was creeping up her spine. But as she took a step forward, the temperature in the room dropped. Her breath misted in the air, and the rocking chair creaked, just a little, as if nudged by an unseen force. Lila's curiosity grew, even as a part of her screamed to turn and run. She knelt in front of the doll, her flashlight shaking in her hand. For a moment, she just stared into its eyes that seemed to stare back at her, empty but not quite. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and for some inexplicable reason, she touched the doll's hand. The instant her skin made contact with the porcelain, the air around her seemed to warp, and the floor beneath her feet seemed to shift. The room spun, and a deep, guttural voice echoed through her mind. "Welcome, Lila." She recoiled, her pulse racing, but her body wouldn't respond. She tried to move, to scream, but her voice was trapped, as though the house itself had swallowed her. "You have come to me, just like the others," the voice continued, soft and menacing. "You will not leave. You belong to me now. You belong to us." A cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing her flashlight. The whispers started then, a cacophony of voices too many to count filling the air, all speaking at once. They spoke of pain, of torment, of countless souls trapped within the house, feeding the curse that bound them all. The doll's eyes glowed brighter now, and Lila's legs buckled beneath her, forcing her to the floor. The house seemed to grow larger, the walls stretching, closing in around her. Her head spun, and her thoughts grew muddled, as if she were losing her sense of self. The doll's voice echoed in her mind again, this time louder, more insistent. "You are mine." Lila could feel something cold, something ancient, wrapping around her, pulling her into the darkness. She tried to fight, tried to scream, but the sound was smothered by the shadows that consumed her. Her body grew heavier, as if the very essence of the house was sinking into her, dragging her down into its depths. And then, she understood. The house wasn't just haunted by a doll. It was the vessel, the keeper of countless lost souls that had been taken by the doll, by the house, by the curse. Each spirit was trapped, feeding the malevolent presence that resided within its walls. And now, Lila was one of them. The last thing she saw before she lost consciousness was the doll, smiling in that same wicked, twisted grin. Its hollow eyes gleamed with triumph, knowing that another soul had been claimed. Lila was no longer herself, she was a part of the house, a part of its cursed history. And as the years would pass, others would come, wanderers, seekers of truth, skeptics who thought they were immune to the house's power. But one by one, they would vanish, becoming a part of the house's darkness, feeding the curse, until there were no more visitors to take. The house, with its cursed rocking chair and the haunted doll, would remain. It would wait in silence, its eyes forever searching for the next soul to claim. And so, the cycle continued. Forever. The end.